Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan, head of Blue Stack Productions, Inc., the publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. I'm very happy today to be here at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth with Conor Murphy. Conor, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much.
Conor, what's your position here at Maynooth?
Right now I'm a lecturer in the Geography Department, and I'm also acting director of ICARUS, which is the Irish Climate Analysis and Research Units here.
Okay.
ICARUS, we've been interested in understanding climate change, initially from an Irish perspective, but more recently from broader contributions. We started off by, from the IPCC reports about asking the questions about how climate change is unfolding from an Irish context, what the impacts across various sectors might be, how we go about mitigating the impacts of climate change, and how we adapt to the impacts of climate change across various sectors. So it's been a broad remit over the last 10 years or so.
Is it about 10 years?
Yeah, 2007 we were formally formed ICARUS.
Okay.
But work in Maynooth on climate change has been going on for a number of years through Professor Sweeney in particular.
So, Conor, not to let you get out of here without explaining what's the derivation for ICARUS as the title for the program?
Well, ICARUS was something that started off about, how do we come up with an acronym that suits what we do, that is broad. Of course, there's the analogy to Greek mythology, and Icarus is the guy who flew too close to the sun. And I suppose there are connotations of risk that are there that become important in talking about climate change, which is really about understanding risk and being able to quantify risk and respond to risk and adapt to risk. So
the magazine recently covered about 4 reports that ICARUS did on for the Irish EPA on climate adaptation. It was particularly the one we covered was coordination, communication, and adaptation for climate change in Ireland. Mm-hmm. And we did it in a report called Climate Change Adaptation in Ireland, a Blueprint Without a Builder, which is basically about the failed government position on adaptation, and showing how what the work you've done shows very concrete, specific examples of what one can do, which are not being adopted by the government policies. So besides the adaptation work that you're doing, what else is in the pipeline at the moment for you?
Well, of course, adaptation remains in the pipeline. It's a big challenge, and I think that was made abundantly clear by the recent IPCC report, in that we are committed to a degree of warming over the coming decades. So adaptation has to be forefront on our agenda. That report, which we colloquially call COCO Adapt, very much looking at how we integrate adaptation into decision making, and that's a big research agenda, and one that doesn't finish at that. So exciting things that we're working on at the moment around adaptation is, again, focusing on how we integrate climate information into decision making at local scales. Traditionally, the approach has been very much a top-down approach, going from emission scenarios, feeding into climate models, and downscale to local scale. And that creates issues with uncertainty and future impacts. So what we're looking at the moment is how you invert that process. So start off by looking at existing vulnerabilities and how you might identify particular adaptation strategies, adaptation decisions, and use the climate science, the information, projections in order to stress test those decisions. And that's really one area that excites me in terms of where we're going at the moment. But there are other areas. We have, in particular, here at ICARUS, there's a group of people led by Rowan Feely in particular, in collaboration with Gerald Mills in UCD, looking at understanding climate of cities, and particularly climate change within cities. Most of the work that we've done so far as a community in Ireland around climate change has been looking at, if it's in hydrology, at natural catchments. But in actual fact, we live in cities. So the biggest impacts that we're going to experience will be in cities. Look at the recent storm events. Look at projections in terms of changes in temperature. If we look at the opportunities to mitigate and to adapt, a lot of that can be focused in cities. So that work is understanding issues around what we might call the metabolism of cities, how a city breathes and functions in terms of emissions of greenhouse gases. about being able to make projections of climate at the scale of the city.
It's a very interesting area, given that 50% of people in the world now
Mhm.
are living in cities, and I think it's going to be 70% by 2050 or thereabouts.
Yeah, I
something
mean,
like that, which is
we are.
huge.
There are a lot of what we might call transformations happening
Yeah.
around us at a global scale at the moment.
Yeah.
It's not just climate change. We're looking at changing how we live as a
Yeah.
species. We're an urban planet at this stage,
Mhm.
and that number of people living in cities is only going to increase over the coming decades, particularly medium-sized cities.
Mhm.
Cities like Dublin across the world are where we're going to see the greatest expansion in population. So being able to create or to look at cities like Dublin as a case study, a laboratory for developing our understanding and contributing to international science in this area, again, is something exciting that's happening here at the moment.
And also certainly in New York, we're very sensitive to extreme storms.
Of course,
with
yeah.
Sandy, which is
Very
an
much so.
eye-opener for a lot. I mean, there was a lot of work being done, but it really pushed the envelope on.
Very much so, and particularly in terms of the complexity and the logistical issues of responding to extreme events,
Mhm.
in terms of how prepared we are from, even from an insurance perspective, and
Mhm.
how that influences people's ability to recover, the resilience to future extreme events. It very much is right at the forefront of understanding climate change and impacts and adaptation at the moment. It's the issue of the city.
It is interesting too that when you mention insurance companies, they get climate change better than almost anybody else.
They do,
They
yeah.
really do, which
Mhm.
is interesting to be on the same side as insurance companies. It's
Yeah, I was
an
reading-
unusual place to be for some of us.
Yeah, yesterday in a newspaper article in The Guardian, the UK insurance companies calling for climate change to be integrated, risks to be integrated into insurance provision as a rule of thumb from now on.
Okay, besides the cities and the adaptation, you're doing some work in Africa.
Yes,
Tell us that.
we've a very interesting project. It's a bit of a diversion from my usual interests. Very interesting project running in Malawi and Zambia. It's an Irish Aid funded project. And essentially what we're doing is working with rural communities around issues of climate change and food security and adaptation. And the project is based around what we call communities of practice. So each of the partner universities within Malawi and Zambia has a community of practice. And we work with students that are non-traditional in the sense that they are in permanent employment with these communities. So they work and engage with communities around various aspects of climate, food security, and so forth. And what the project is at its heart is most interested in doing is transforming the role of those communities in providing input into policy and decisions that are taken in dealing with extreme events and climate over the coming decades. And that in many cases when we look at climate policy, particularly from an African context, it tends to be very much top-down and driven by very much a Western approach.
Mhm.
So it becomes extremely important, if we are to adapt successfully, to increase the voice that local communities, particularly the most vulnerable, can have in the decision-making process for identifying the bottlenecks that are in existence for people to actually access resources, to adapt or to increase their coping capacity in dealing with extremes. And that project has been a real eye-opener for myself in terms of actually understanding the real vulnerabilities that exist in the context of climate change.
Mhm.
In that, an extreme event or flood event can have quite serious implications for these communities. It's not just loss of infrastructure,
Mhm.
it has long-term implications for these people's lives, their livelihoods, their well-being. It's a really interesting project, and one that is highlighting a number of exciting directions forward.
Mhm.
In particular, it highlights to me that if we are to deal with adaptation, we need to have interdisciplinary approaches.
Mhm.
So this project brings together biologists, it brings together people from adult education, from geography, from sociology, in order to really understand what's happening in a community, integrating the views of communities in particular.
Yeah, I want to come back to this interdisciplinary, because I know that's a particular interest of yours.
Mhm.
Of yours, it has been for a long time. But I wanted to talk to you about something we had talked about earlier, and that is, as part of this program, you're running into the issue of old traditional religious and cultural values, which are complicating the process.
Yeah, it's something that was extremely interesting to me, and it entirely caught me off guard, as in something that was entirely unexpected. what we're seeing within communities we're working with is that there are some big changes happening at the moment. It's not just climate. And for example, at the moment, rural communities in Africa, over the last 10 years or so, have been experiencing a transition in terms of religious institutions, religious beliefs, in that traditionally a lot of the coping strategies that these communities have for dealing with extremes is based on indigenous knowledge. And of course that indigenous knowledge is oftentimes tied to traditional belief systems. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing increasingly is that with the expansion of what we might call contemporary religions, and there are many denominations as a generalization, there is somewhat of a conflict emerging between those contemporary religions and the practice of traditional belief systems. Mm-hmm. That can cause conflict around certain coping strategies, adaptation processes.
It's a very sensitive position for you to be in, to be encouraging people to pay attention to past coping behaviors.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of an older practice that's now maybe
there's
complicated?
Offhand, if I can think of during, for example, an extreme event, there may be religious or traditional practices or ceremonies that would be enacted in terms of maybe it's looking at ancestral practices that community chiefs might practice in order to make advisory statements to the community.
Uh-huh.
And when that ceremony is part of the decision-making process. Mm-hmm. And when you have communities more and more turning towards the contemporary religions, mm-hmm. those practices tend to be frowned upon. So people who are, in terms of what crop to grow or timing of planting or growing that crop, once that information stream begins to be cut off, or mm-hmm. there's within society, if those people become marginalized because of those beliefs, it decreases their coping capacity.
Now, it's interesting, one of the interesting issues you mentioned was economics, and I must say 25 years ago, none of us in environmental was talking about economics, and I
mm-hmm.
never do numbers, but you can't not talk about economics in terms of climate change and other issues now. Yeah. Energy is something we never talked about before.
Yeah, well, economics I wouldn't say is part of my skill set either. Yeah. But of course you can't. I mean, you have to include economics, particularly during straitened times as we are at the moment. Right. Integrating climate change into economic decision making is going to be important. If you take the example of flood risk infrastructure in Ireland, for example, how much of a headroom do we build on infrastructure is a very important economic decision. Mm-hmm. In that trading off the costs and benefits, there are other things that are important rather than the normal things that are incorporating cost-benefit analysis. Mm-hmm. But the extent of extra capacity that we build on is an economic question, but it's very much related to the uncertainties in future flood risk. Mm-hmm. If you have infrastructure like that, if it fails, it has that's devastating potentially implications for communities that rely upon it. Mm-hmm. So very much so the interaction of economics and risk, and particularly uncertainties, is going to be a crucial issue in mm-hmm. terms of adapting to climate change.
And one of the things that you and I have talked about over the last couple of years as we've met, it's kind of, I think, flows partly out of that interest, is how do we talk about climate change? And what a challenge that is.
It really is. I mean, it's almost, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and that the risks of climate change are very real. But yet, if you go out and communicate with the media around the findings of your research and it's seen to be alarmist and extreme, it tends to turn people off. Mm-hmm. And I can see that. Then at the other side of the coin, if you are very much towards the lower end of the distribution in terms of future changes, mm-hmm. It doesn't create that momentum or highlight the importance of integrating climate change into decision making. Mm-hmm. So it really it's a tricky area. But I think that what is important, and particularly from the most recent IPCC reports and international research, is that idea of integrating climate change into other parts of change that are happening within society. Mm-hmm. I think we have to move beyond, particularly when we're talking about adaptation to climate change, move away from climate exceptionalism yes, we know that climate change is a real issue. It's going to become progressively more of an issue as the decades progress.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to understand how it integrates into other parts of decision making within society.
Mm-hmm.
And I think once we can begin to do that, it increases the awareness among the population of actually how climate change can impact on day-to-day activities, on their lives. It seems to be very much an issue, particularly here in Ireland, that climate change is seen as something that's out there. The risks are further afield. That temperate Ireland, we don't get that many extremes. But I think that extreme events like the winter that we've just seen, every so often bring back to people in Ireland that yes, we do have high levels of exposure. We are vulnerable, particularly our cities.
Is there any way in which you incorporate that kind of issue and that way of approaching things in teaching scientists? Because they're going to have to go out and engage.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about engaging in a political arena, which can be very contentious and dangerous.
So.
How do they develop the language skills and to do that?
Yeah, at the moment it tends to be the scientists going out and learning from experience. Once bitten, twice shy, those kind of things. But I think there very much is a need for education around environmental sciences, around environmental change, and particularly around climate change, about the communication of risk. Mm-hmm. There are really interesting opportunities for doing so. I mean, as part of the MSc in climate change here, we would hope to integrate a modular component of that into next year's course. So there is a responsibility on scientists to communicate the implications of their findings, whether it's interaction with decision makers, whether it's communication with the media. As being part of a university, we maybe in the past have locked ourselves up in ivory towers, but we're there for a public good, and if our research has implications for society, we have to be able to communicate that. If you take the example of water resources or something like that, if you're an environmental series of river flows or something like that, if you're looking for trends in that data, you may not find a significant trend. But just because that trend is not statistically significant does not mean that it's not practically significant. In that, there's in science, in many cases, we have these extremely high thresholds. And that's right, and we have to have that. But when it comes to integrating information into society, for example, of what's practically important, we need to understand what's practically relevant, how these changes impact on society. And that statistically significant has no relationship with practically significant. And it's important that we think about those differences.
And we hope you continue to do that. Thanks for talking with us today, Conor.
Real pleasure. Thank you.